Well then. Shall we?
Let's do this.
This Dragon Age game isn't like the Dragon Age games you might be familiar with. Granted, it's still a fantasy RPG, weaving tales of demons, magic, and ancient forces set on causing chaos. But outside of familiar story elements and characters, there's been a lot of change in the decade since Dragon Age Inquisition. Dragon Age the Veilguard launched on PC, PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series on the 31st of October 2024. The footage you're seeing here has been captured on the PC version of the game. Veilguard follows threads and features characters that are fixtures in the series, but you don't need to have any prior knowledge of events or indeed experience playing the Dragon Age series to pick this up, as the early parts of the narrative fill in the relevant information well. Before beginning the game, you get a shader compile and a chance to look through the settings menu. This is a long and detailed list of everything from ray tracing options to additional accessibility support. I'm going to touch on this a bit more later, but this game performs incredibly well. It is without a doubt one of the best performing AAA PC games I've played this year. One of the first times in recent memory where I believe the game is appropriately optimized and doesn't need my frankly overkill hardware just to get close to stability. From this menu you dive into character creation, which includes an impressively deep customization tool. Here you pick your race, gender and backstory. At first glance, it looks like there are only 3 classes in the game: warrior, rogue and mage. But you can branch off into more advanced roles like assassin or archer, tank or berserker once you get into the game. I made some minor tweaks to one of the preset elf characters and rolled a mage, with intentions to turn him into a backstory appropriate necromancer a bit later on, and began the adventure. Some of this story is narrated by Varric, a reoccurring character from the franchise, who recounts the actions of the elven mage Solus as a form of introduction. The majority of the action is told via in-engine cutscenes or dialogue, but Varric's voice is often used over the top of mural artwork to provide additional exposition and foreshadowing.
But long ago, he had a different name, the Dreadwolf.
The player character, addressed throughout the game as Rook, is part of a team put together by Varric to ambush Solus's deadly ritual. Quite predictably, things go awry and the consequences of this attempt lands Varric in bandages and unleashes a greater threat than Solus ever was. Thus, it then falls to the player character to lead the team and recruit new allies to stop the rise of 2 released and vengeful elven gods. Even in the earliest stages of the game, where the premise is being set up, the strength of the writing and characters comes through. There's a good mix of charismatic charm and quick quips to support any type of playthrough, and early companions Varric and Harding are examples of some of the better voice acting you'll hear in gaming. Once the plot settles, the new hub of the Lighthouse behaves a lot like Dragon Age Inquisition's Keep. This is a designed safe space to go to between all the jumping and diving into locations that are either in turmoil because of the new gods, or because of the differences the game's factions and cults have. The writing is a supportive tool throughout this, and the game's choices help you dig into parts of conversations where you may need additional context. This helps when you form the rest of your team, as your companions are as eccentric and varied as they come. Take the Qunari Dragon Hunter, who is the definition of headstrong yet uncertain, or the enthusiastic scholar and his butler Manfred. Then there's a one-footed mage/detective, and a neurotic hyperfixating elf for good measure. This cast isn't boring, and the writing for the companions is a cocktail of cliches, contemporary issues, and questions of identity. This leaves some of it to be endearing, some of it to be comedically wrapped exposition, and some of it just left me unsure how I was supposed to react. I mean all that as a compliment, because writing characters, good or bad, should be relevant and relatable, but never safe. Hitting a spectrum of emotions and feelings I can't fully comprehend is significantly better than rolling out generic paint-by-numbers figures you'll forget about before 2024 is over. Assembling the team is only half the job though. The other half is saving the world, and this loses some of its edge. The lack of a physical presence of the two gods that are supposedly causing all of the chaos and destruction is an issue early on. You're told a lot about their methods and how people fear them, and at times you rush to aid their victims. But I struggled to view them as the threat the games tell you they are until the midpoint in the story, when you finally come face to face. This gets much better as you progress the plot after that point, but I still found these villains to be less interesting than Solus, who was the game's originally presented antagonist. What held the game together through these moments of uncertainty was, surprisingly, the protagonist. My elf was witty and charming. He made light of every situation and stuck up for his friends. Even the parts where I didn't have a dialogue choice, and the conversation was set in stone, it felt like it fit his character. I also like how my chosen backstory meant that Rook organically became friends with Emmerich, another Mournwatcher, and their additional dialogue choices really added some macabre humour at times. As the game approached its end, I was expecting to find myself rolling my eyes at the reveals and twists, but that never came. Some of this was predictable, and some of it wasn't. But in general, I found the main narrative to be well told and interesting. This is much improved on Inquisition, where the story was good, but there were instances where you felt like your character was a disinterested meat slab, awkwardly interjecting random thoughts into serious conversation. The flow of dialogue and the transition into and out of choices is much better here. There does feel as though there's been a narrowing in the scope of dialogue choices as a result. Even at times where you really want there to be an option where you aggressively stand up to someone, this is tempered into quips and snark, and the loss of the Paragon Renegade good-evil style system is felt strongly with these more tepid reactions. Other parts of Inquisition's mechanics bleed over into this game too, with a softer hand pushing them. Once again, you have an isolated hub area where you can meet with your companions and navigate to the battlefields that call you. This isn't a castle, so much as the floating remains of one trapped in the Fade. This provides a safe retreat between missions, but lacks a lot of the incidental atmosphere the Inquisition's base provided. What's missing is soldiers on the battlements, or recruits training in the yard. Incidental activities that suggest life is here. There's few NPCs in this hub outside of the main cast, and even once everybody is recruited, this feels very empty in places. To replace a lot of the functionality, there is a spirit called the Caretaker here, who is part guide and part housekeeper. He can upgrade gear and perform enchantments. Locating mementos out in the world and bringing them back unlocks more tiers of service, which include higher numbers in gear upgrades and better enchantments. As you might expect, you find new gear in shops, chests, loot, or quest rewards. Gear is split into weapons, helms, armour, amulets, and rings for the protagonist, and weapons, armour, and keepsakes for your companions. The gear that is presented to the player is more restrictive than you'd expect for this type of RPG, especially if you've played any Dragon Age title previously. You either get pieces the protagonist can equip, or you are given companion-specific gear when you acquire an item. No longer can you find a staff for yourself, and then move it to your own mage when you're done with it. This means that weapons only drop for the class that you chose at the start of the game, and everybody else is granted bespoke, character-specific items that fit their roles. On the one hand, this means that you're not going to be opening a chest to find a bow your protagonist can't use. But it also takes away from a large aspect of RPG games which feature other characters, which is fleshing out their builds and experimenting with your team's collective assets. Inventories are very much character-specific here. Each item has an upgrade value, which can go up to 10, and a rarity using the well-known colour scheme. Finding another instance of an item, or at least a chest or event which triggers an upgrade, increases the rarity of said item, so your common knife can become legendary by the end of the game. This will help with attachment if you find a piece you really like and don't want to swap it out, There's also a cosmetic function in the game where you can change the appearance of items and hide your head armor, which is particularly useful, as I didn't like many of the helmets here. While I have mixed thoughts on how these loot changes affect your companions, I do like the change to upgrading your own gear. This is an interesting system that keeps you feeling like you're progressing. Without the constant inventory management, your protagonist has a regular level and gains XP too, but this doesn't affect the gear you can equip. Your level only affects certain skills on the skill tree, in particular the specializations, and its related skills. These are locked behind levels 20, 30 and 40. Your level itself caps out at 50, and you can acquire additional skill points by finding certain items in-game. This feels very familiar for an RPG game, and there's a mix of active skills and passive gains to choose from. These come in handy when you're out saving the world. Adjacent to the hub area, there is a place called the Crossroads, from which you can access magic gates that let you travel to locations throughout the world of Thedas. These areas are instanced and sees the protagonist run around from a third-person vantage point to converse with locals, buy new items, or get caught up in quests and battles. Speaking of battles, combat is really where the biggest changes in this game manifest, and not always for the better. You have light attacks, charged attacks, and variants of these. These are woven between abilities, of which you can have 3 equipped at any time. The player also has an ultimate ability and a rune which can be used in combat. There are dodgers and guards to help mitigate damage as well. Perhaps the most apparent element of combat to franchise veterans is that 3 abilities is a very limited number, and it does make your options in combat more restrictive. You can unlock significantly more than 3 skills, but only have 3 of these equipped at a time. Another change is that you can now only control the protagonist, and do not have any direct control over the other characters you choose to bring with you, other than issuing commands on cooldown. In many ways, your 3-member team feels like a 1-person team, with a choice of 6 additional abilities. Or really 2 additional abilities. Unlike your own skills, once you use one of your companions, all of their actions go on cooldown, regardless of which skill you used. This is a little similar to what the Mass Effect games have done previously, but this is the first time this mechanic has shown up in Dragon Age. I can't stress enough that this feels like you're just a one-man army with basically 2 accessories that grant abilities. I've never seen these companions get knocked out or killed, show any indication they've taken any real damage. They don't have health bars you need to pay attention to, so you just focus on your own. They just don't feel like they have a significant presence in combat. The enemies seem to agree a lot of the time too, as there are many instances of this game where they are practically invisible to the enemies who make a beeline for you. The first 10 hours of my playthrough were filled with strong writing and that consistent Dragon Age world building. But this was also 10 hours where every single combat encounter was filled with enemies that just went straight for me. My character is not really meant to be the main tank, but I was forced to play a heavily evasive playstyle at a high intensity, as though I was a frontline combatant. Because every bit of damage is heading in your direction, the game's targeting prioritizes the player character incessantly, even when you're not pumping out damage. It's not until around 9 to 10 hours in, when the Grey Warden joins your party, that you gain a taunt ability to act as mitigation against this issue. But that taunt has a cooldown, and enemies rarely seem to want to target your companions, even when one of them's dealt them a critical hit. These mechanics all add up to give me the impression that your companions don't really exist when you're in combat. They're just a few extra buttons you can click to do damage, and that's really disappointing. It's also a massive shift from the last time we saw Dragon Age, back in 2014, where you could take direct control of your companions should the Inquisitor fall, give orders from on high, or take the fight directly to the enemy. I'm open to change, or at least I like to think I am, and I'd rather see new things try and fail than stick with the boring. But this execution helps contribute towards a feeling that these companions don't matter at all. The companions themselves are reduced to what prime and detonation skills they bring. This flies directly in the face of the effort the game puts forward in the narrative and the hub sections to reinforce their importance, presence, and value to the team. Finally, this adds up to a general feeling that everything about the game has been aggressively streamlined, and in the process removed a lot of what historically made Dragon Age, Dragon Age. From the loot changes to the removal of full companion skill trees, it feels like the concept of a party and having additional characters in combat is being phased out hard. It's like any RPG mechanic or gearing choice related to these companions that requires the player to think for more than a second has just been stripped away. As a result, combat feels hectic and chaotic, which at times is good and others bad. If you approach this game without any history in the series, this action-based combat is perfectly serviceable, and it keeps you busy, even if it really does start to feel repetitive towards the end, particularly when you're encountering constant blight blisters and having to take out the same darkspawn enemies over and over and over. The intensity in combat is something that some people might like, but I'm of the opinion that it's a much better system for melee classes than ranged ones. I even started a second playthrough to confirm this. The enemies still target you heavily, but it's easier to deal with the pressure when you've got a sword and a shield. The enemy design for their part is fine. There's a good mix of ranged and melee enemies, with shields, armour and other defensive tricks for you to overcome. There's also an elemental weakness system, status effects and afflictions, and combos. But you're only allowed 3 abilities, and you choose which of these you want to take with you before combat. There's no meaningful adjustment on the fly, or choosing one of your lesser used spells, because a new enemy is weak to it. If you bring the wrong element to a fight, you have to make do with what you chose until it's over. I'm going to take this opportunity to pepper in some of my other minor gameplay gripes here, but I do promise, it's nothing as sweeping as the companion and control changes. I mean little things, like the weak jump that almost always results in these moments of panic, where you're not quite sure if you've missed the ledge or just grabbed onto it. Or the inconsistent water effects on clothing, where rain appears sometimes but clothing fabric doesn't get wet. There are also quests in the log that don't have any indication of difficulty, letting you saunter into a fight against a level 50 dragon before you've hit level 30, which feels counterintuitive to the rest of the game, which has really taken steps forward in accessibility and in presenting information to the player. Stepping away from gameplay, the environmental variety is strong, with different settings from a dreary slum town in a city to an open elven woodland. Each of these landscapes is scattered with puzzles, chests, and collectible notes, and feels more contained and meaningful than an open world. These areas being instanced and limited in size helps reduce map bloat, but it's difficult to get a feel for how all of these are interconnected with each other. A large part of the reason this comes off well is because of the technical performance of this game, which is excellent. I consistently got 60 FPS throughout this game, and had to run into a weird graphical glitch and an area with water and lightning effects all at once to get the game to stutter, and that was only for the briefest moment. This performance doesn't come at a great cost to graphical presentation either, as the character modelling, specifically facial features and animations, are solid. One additional area to single out for praise is hair on characters. This feels fairly realistic, and as I moved around levels and ran, I made sure to deliberately choose a Sephiroth-esque evil mane. There's also strong lighting in areas that are outside, but a lot of the environments are deliberately dreary by design, as they're ravaged with the blight. You do occasionally run into some combat instances where there's a lot of particle effects flying around, but this game didn't crash, nor did I run into any problems with quests or progression. I could have been fairly lucky, but the impression I got from this is that the game is very well polished. Sound design is somewhat mixed, but that's fine. The music here doesn't really stand out, and even when I went back to try and pick up something to critique, all of it feels there. Nothing really jumps out at you. It's the same with weapon effects too. Everything is just there, and it doesn't intrude in your thoughts, which itself says a lot positively. The voice acting, on the other hand, stacks up against some of the best. There is nothing that screams Dragon Age quite like hearing Claudia Black's Morrigan, or the baritone of Brian Bloom's Varric, foreshadowing the upcoming battles.
Whilst I cannot claim the same depth of knowledge, the knowledge I do possess is yours for the asking.
The best day of his life, Solus wouldn't see you coming, Rook. And don't worry, I'll still be here to talk if you need me.
And of course, Matt Mercer's role as Manfred the Skeletal Butler will go down in video game history.
Welcome aboard.
Wonderful! I'll gather my things. Come, Manfred.
Dragon Age the Veilguard is roughly half of the Dragon Age game veterans of this franchise know. It has the storytelling, it has the factions, and it has the narrative aspects spot on. And the technological advances here help bring these characters into focus in a way that wasn't possible when Origins or even Inquisition launched. The game does a great job making you feel like you might have made the wrong decision, but convincing you via sheer morbid curiosity to see it through, regardless. And that's strong praise. We could argue for days about some of the game's characters, but I land on the side of, this is new, it's a little different, but it works well. The gameplay side of the game is something that gnawed away at me, and not just because it's different to the Dragon Age games that have come before. It feels as though it's been overly refined to the point where it's just shallow and simple, like a sculptor who smoothed the corners of a cube so much that it's become a sphere. It's something that fundamentally alters my perception of the Dragon Age franchise going forward. If you can look past that, or if you dislike the party aspect of RPGs, such as managing multiple NPCs, builds, and skill trees, you'll likely rate this higher than I do. But right now, after seeing the credits roll, the only word I can think of to accurately surmise Dragon Age the Veilguard is divisive. And which side of that line you fall on makes all the difference here.
There you have it.